On a crisp Saturday morning in October 1958, 12-year-old Timothy Morrison stood outside the First Presbyterian Church in Arlington, Virginia, adjusting his Boy Scout neckerchief with fingers still clumsy from the autumn cold. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, where Troop 83 gathered for their monthly community service project, and Timothy could smell the earthy scent of fallen leaves, mixing with the exhaust from his Scoutmaster's station wagon. He believed that this would be just another ordinary weekend collecting newspapers for the recycling drive, another chance to earn a merit badge, and maybe impress his father who worked at the Pentagon. What Timothy could not have imagined was that within 3 hours, his simple act of civic duty would unravel one of the most sophisticated Soviet intelligence operations on American soil, forever changing the course of his young life and striking a significant blow to Moscow's espionage network during one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Timothy had joined Troop 83 6 months earlier, desperate to escape the suffocating grief that had settled over his household like morning fog. His older brother, Michael, had been killed in Korea 5 years prior, and their mother had never quite recovered from the loss. She moved through their modest colonial home like a ghost herself, cooking meals she barely touched, folding laundry with mechanical precision, her eyes always focused on something far beyond the walls of their living room. Timothy's father, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Morrison, dealt with his pain differently, burying himself in his work at the Pentagon, where he served as a logistics officer in the Army's European Command. The Scout meetings gave Timothy somewhere to belong, a place where he could be judged on his own merits, rather than forever standing in the shadow of a brother he could barely remember but could never escape. The recycling drive had been organized by their Scoutmaster, Ernest Fletcher, a 43-year-old postal worker with a gentle manner and endless patience for the chaos that 11 boys between the ages of 10 and 14 could create. Fletcher had moved to Arlington 3 years earlier from somewhere out west, Nebraska or Kansas, and had quickly become beloved in the neighborhood for his willingness to help anyone with anything. He coached Little League in the spring, organized the church's annual 4th of July picnic, and never missed a Scout meeting. His wife, Margaret, taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school and made the best apple pie in the county, or so everyone agreed. They seemed like the perfect American family, though they had no children of their own, which the neighborhood ladies attributed to some unspoken tragedy that polite people did not discuss. The plan for the day was straightforward. The Scouts would fan out across 4 residential blocks in teams of 2, knocking on doors and collecting bundled newspapers that families had set aside for the drive. The collected papers would be loaded into Fletcher's station wagon and Mr. Hendricks's pickup truck, then driven to the recycling depot where they would be weighed, and the troop would receive 3 cents per pound to put toward their summer camping trip to Shenandoah National Park. Timothy had been paired with his best friend, Danny Kowalski, a wiry kid with black hair that never stayed combed, and a gap between his front teeth that made him whistle when he talked. The morning started according to plan. Timothy and Danny worked their way down Maple Street, collecting neat bundles of newspapers from porches and front steps. Mrs. Henderson gave them each a molasses cookie and asked about their families. Old Mr. Yates complained about the Soviets and their Sputnik satellite for 10 minutes, before finally handing over his stack of papers. The Wilson family's German shepherd barked ferociously until Mrs. Wilson came out and revealed that Duke was afraid of squirrels and would not hurt a fly. By 10:30, both boys had their arms full and were heading back toward the church parking lot for their 3rd trip. That was when they noticed the house on the corner of Maple and Oak, a modest Cape Cod with dark green shutters and an overgrown garden that suggested the residents were either very busy or very private. A stack of newspapers sat beside the front door, bound with twine in a way that struck Timothy as unusual. Most people used string or left the papers loose in boxes, but these were wrapped with precision, the twine making perfect crosses at each intersection, the edges of the papers aligned with almost military exactness. Timothy knocked on the door while Danny waited on the sidewalk, shifting his weight from foot to foot in the way he always did when he was impatient. No one answered. Timothy knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. He tried the doorbell and heard it chime inside the house, but after 30 seconds of waiting, it became clear that no one was home or no one was planning to answer. Timothy looked at Danny and shrugged. Danny made a face that suggested they should just take the newspapers and move on. Timothy hesitated. Mr. Fletcher had been very clear about the rules. They were to knock, identify themselves as Boy Scouts, and only take newspapers that were explicitly offered, or that had been left outside with clear indication they were meant for collection. But the papers were right there beside the door, obviously bundled for some purpose, and they were already behind schedule. Timothy made a decision. He reached down to pick up the top bundle, and as he did, the twine slipped. The bundle came apart in his hands, newspapers sliding everywhere across the porch. Timothy muttered an apology to no one in particular and started gathering them up. That was when he noticed the envelope. It had been tucked between two newspapers in the middle of the bundle, a plain manila envelope with no markings on the outside. It was sealed, and something inside gave it weight and stiffness. Timothy picked it up, turning it over in his hands. His scout training kicked in. They had just earned their citizenship in the Community Merit Badge, and one of the lessons had been about respecting other people's property and privacy. This clearly was not trash. This was something someone had hidden. He should have put it back. He should have rebundled the newspapers and left them where they were. But Timothy Morrison was 12 years old and curious, and the envelope felt important in a way he could not quite explain. He slipped it into his jacket pocket, gathered up the newspapers more carefully this time, and carried them back to where Danny waited. They did not talk about the envelope. Timothy did not mention it, and something in his expression must have warned Danny not to ask. They finished their route, loaded the last of the newspapers into Mr. Fletcher's station wagon, and accepted the hot chocolate and donuts that Mrs. Fletcher had brought from home. Timothy sat on the church steps, the envelope pressing against his ribs like a secret, while the other scouts laughed and jostled and complained about sore arms. He waited until he got home to open it. His father was at work as usual. His mother was in the kitchen, preparing a pot roast that Timothy knew she would barely eat. He went upstairs to his room, closed the door, and carefully unsealed the envelope. Inside were photographs, not normal photographs, but what Timothy would later learn were called contact sheets, dozens of small images arranged in rows on several larger sheets of photographic paper. Timothy spread them out on his bed and studied them with growing confusion and then growing alarm. The photographs showed documents, official documents with stamps and seals and typing in neat rows. Some were in English, but many appeared to be in other languages. Timothy could not read most of them, but he recognized certain words and symbols: top secret, confidential, NATO. There were diagrams that looked like military installations, complete with guard positions and patrol routes carefully marked. There were lists of names with what appeared to be ranks and assignments. There were maps showing what Timothy recognized as European countries, with markers and notations in what might have been Russian. Timothy's heart started beating faster. He had grown up in the shadow of the Cold War, participating in duck and cover drills at school, watching newsreels about the Berlin airlift and the Hungarian Revolution. His father had explained to him once, in careful terms, why the work he did at the Pentagon was so important, why America had to stay vigilant against the threat of communism, why people like his brother Michael had died in Korea fighting to stop the spread of Soviet influence. Timothy did not understand everything about geopolitics and ideology, but he understood this. The photographs spread across his bedspread looked exactly like the kind of thing a spy would have. He felt sick to his stomach. He also felt a strange excitement, a sense that he had stumbled onto something monumentally important. But mostly he felt scared. Scared because he had taken something that did not belong to him, scared because possessing these photographs might somehow make him complicit in whatever they represented. Scared because he had no idea what to do next. Timothy thought about telling his mother, but dismissed the idea immediately. She would not understand. She would probably just tell him to put them back and forget about them, and the thought of returning to that house made his skin crawl. He thought about telling Mr. Fletcher, but something stopped him. The photographs had been hidden in newspapers collected from neighborhood homes. What if Mr. Fletcher was somehow involved? The thought seemed absurd. But once it entered Timothy's mind, he could not shake it. That left his father. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison would know what to do. He dealt with classified information every day. He would understand the significance of what Timothy had found. But Timothy's father would not be home until 7 o'clock at the earliest, and Timothy did not think he could wait that long with this secret burning a hole in his conscience. He made another decision. He would go to the police. The Arlington Police Department had given a presentation at his school the previous spring about what to do in emergencies, and Officer Williams, who had spoken to them, had seemed kind and trustworthy. Timothy carefully placed the photographs back in the envelope, tucked it under his mattress for safekeeping, and went downstairs. His mother was sitting at the kitchen table, staring out the window at nothing. Timothy told her he was going to ride his bike to Danny's house and would be back before dinner. She nodded without really looking at him and reminded him to wear his jacket. Timothy felt a pang of guilt for lying, but he pushed it aside and headed out the door. The Arlington Police Department occupied a brick building on Wilson Boulevard, about 2 miles from Timothy's house. He had never been inside before. The front desk was manned by a gray-haired sergeant who looked up from his paperwork with an expression of mild surprise when Timothy walked in. Timothy Morrison asked if he could speak to Officer Williams. The sergeant explained that Officer Williams was out on patrol, but asked if there was something he could help with. Timothy hesitated, suddenly aware of how ridiculous his story was going to sound. A 12-year-old Boy Scout thought he had found evidence of Soviet espionage while collecting newspapers, but he had come this far. So he took a deep breath and started explaining. To the sergeant's credit, he did not laugh or dismiss Timothy out of hand. Instead, he listened carefully, asking occasional questions about where Timothy had found the envelope and what exactly he had seen in the photographs. When Timothy finished, the sergeant was quiet for a moment, tapping his pen against the desk in a rhythmic pattern that reminded Timothy of Morse code. The sergeant said he thought this was probably something the FBI should handle rather than local police, especially if Timothy was right about what he had seen. He asked Timothy to wait and disappeared into a back office. Timothy sat in a hard plastic chair, his stomach churning with a mixture of anxiety and relief. He had done the right thing. He had brought this to the authorities. Whatever happened next was out of his hands. Except it was not out of his hands at all. 20 minutes later, 2 men in dark suits arrived at the police station and asked to speak with Timothy Morrison. They introduced themselves as Special Agents Robert Carlson and James Murphy from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Washington Field Office. They were polite but serious, and they wanted to know everything Timothy could tell them about the envelope and the photographs. Timothy repeated his story, this time with more detail. He described the house on the corner of Maple and Oak, the precise way the newspapers had been bundled, the moment the bundle came apart and revealed the hidden envelope. He described the photographs as best he could, mentioning the words top secret and NATO, the maps and diagrams, the lists of names. The 2 agents listened without interrupting, occasionally exchanging glances that Timothy could not interpret. When Timothy finished, Agent Carlson asked if Timothy still had the envelope and photographs. Timothy admitted that he did, that they were hidden under his mattress at home. Agent Murphy asked if Timothy would be willing to show them the photographs and point out the house where he had found them. Timothy agreed immediately, feeling a surge of importance that temporarily overwhelmed his nervousness. The 3 of them drove to Timothy's house in an unmarked FBI sedan, a black Ford that smelled like cigarettes and old coffee. Timothy's mother looked startled when he walked in with 2 federal agents, but Agent Carlson quickly assured her that Timothy was not in any trouble and that he had actually been very helpful with an ongoing investigation. They needed to collect some evidence from his room, if that was acceptable. Timothy's mother, bewildered but trusting the authority represented by the dark suits and official badges, simply nodded and gestured toward the stairs. Timothy retrieved the envelope from under his mattress and handed it to Agent Carlson. The agent opened it carefully, examining the photographs without removing them from the envelope. His expression remained neutral, but Timothy saw something flicker in his eyes. Recognition, confirmation, perhaps even alarm. Agent Carlson asked Timothy's mother if they could use her telephone. She pointed to the one in the kitchen, and Carlson spent several minutes speaking in low tones to someone on the other end. When he returned, He asked Timothy if he would mind riding with them to point out the house where the newspapers had been collected. Timothy's mother started to object, concerned about her son being driven around by strangers. But Agent Murphy produced his credentials again and assured her they would have Timothy home within the hour. The house on the corner of Maple and Oak looked even more innocuous in the afternoon light. The overgrown garden swayed gently in the breeze, and somewhere a neighbor was running a lawnmower, the sound creating a reassuring sense of suburban normalcy. The agents asked Timothy to stay in the car while they approached the house and knocked on the door. Once again, no one answered. Timothy watched as Agent Carlson walked around the perimeter of the house, peering in windows and examining the yard with the careful attention of someone conducting a search. Agent Murphy returned to the car and asked Timothy more questions about the recycling drive, about Mr. Fletcher and the other scouts, about whether Timothy had noticed anything else unusual about the house or its occupants. Timothy answered as best he could, but he realized he knew almost nothing about the people who lived there. He did not know their names or what they looked like, or even how long they had lived in the neighborhood. Agent Carlson returned to the car and made another phone call from a payphone on the corner, speaking for several minutes before hanging up and walking back to where Murphy and Timothy waited. He told Timothy they were taking him home now, and that he had done an excellent job as a citizen and a scout. He also said something that made Timothy's blood run cold. He said that Timothy should not mention any of this to anyone, not his friends, not his scout troop, not even his father, at least not until the FBI had completed their investigation. National security was at stake, and loose talk could compromise an important operation. Timothy agreed, though his mind was reeling. National security, important operation. The words sounded like something out of a spy novel, and yet here he was sitting in an FBI sedan, being driven home by real federal agents who were taking his accidental discovery very seriously indeed. They dropped him off at his house with repeated instructions to keep quiet and a promise that someone would be in touch soon to let him know what happened. Timothy watched the black Ford drive away, then went inside where his mother demanded to know what that was all about. Timothy, following the FBI's instructions but feeling terrible about lying to her, said it was just a misunderstanding about some papers he had found and that everything was fine. His mother looked unconvinced but did not press the issue, perhaps because pressing issues required an energy she no longer possessed. Timothy's father came home at 7:15 that evening. Carrying his briefcase and the weight of whatever he had dealt with at the Pentagon that day, over pot roast that had cooked too long and become dry, Timothy wanted desperately to tell him about the photographs and the FBI agents and the house on Maple Street. But he had promised to keep quiet, and scouts kept their promises. So he ate his dinner and listened to his father talk about upcoming changes to supply routes in Germany, and his mother's silence. And he felt the secret growing heavier inside him with each passing minute. The next week passed in a state of heightened anxiety for Timothy Morrison. He went to school and tried to concentrate on fractions and state capitals, but his mind kept wandering back to the photographs and what they might mean. He attended the scout meeting on Wednesday evening, where Mr. Fletcher praised the troop for collecting over 600 pounds of newspapers and announced they were well on their way to affording the camping trip. Timothy watched Fletcher carefully, looking for any sign of guilt or nervousness, but saw only the same friendly scoutmaster he had always known. On Friday afternoon, 9 days after Timothy had found the envelope, Agent Carlson called the Morrison household and asked to speak with Timothy's father. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison took the call in his study with the door closed, and Timothy could hear only the low rumble of his voice, punctuated by long silences that suggested he was listening more than talking. When his father emerged 20 minutes later, his expression was carefully controlled, but Timothy could see the tension in his jaw and the way his hands gripped the newspaper he was carrying. Harold Morrison asked his son to join him in the study and closed the door behind them. He sat down behind his desk and looked at Timothy for a long moment before speaking. He said the FBI had informed him about what Timothy had found and what Timothy had done, and that he wanted Timothy to know he was proud of him for making the right choice in bringing the photographs to the authorities. But he also needed Timothy to understand how serious this situation was and why it was absolutely critical that Timothy continued to keep quiet about everything he had seen and heard. Timothy's father explained, in terms suitable for a 12-year-old but without talking down to him, that the photographs Timothy had found were evidence of Soviet espionage. They were copies of classified military documents that never should have been outside secure government facilities, let alone hidden in a bundle of newspapers in suburban Arlington. The FBI had been conducting surveillance on several suspected Soviet agents operating in the Washington area, and the information Timothy had provided had helped them make connections they had been unable to make through their own investigation. Harold Morrison paused, choosing his words carefully, before telling his son something that made Timothy's hands go cold. The house where Timothy had found the envelope belonged to a man named Viktor Petrov, who worked as a translator at the Soviet embassy. Petrov was suspected of being an intelligence officer for the KGB, the Soviet Union's spy agency, but the FBI had not been able to gather enough evidence to prove it or to determine how he was receiving classified information from his sources. The photographs Timothy had found were likely meant to be picked up by another Soviet operative who would transport them out of the country, possibly in a diplomatic pouch that could not be searched. Timothy asked what would happen to Mr. Petrov. His father said that was now a matter for the FBI and the State Department, but that Timothy should not be surprised if the Petrov family disappeared from the neighborhood in the very near future. Diplomatic immunity meant that Petrov could not be arrested or prosecuted in the United States, but he could certainly be declared persona non grata and expelled from the country. More importantly, the FBI now had evidence of an active espionage operation which would allow them to investigate Petrov's contacts and hopefully identify the source or sources who were providing him with classified documents. Timothy felt a complex mixture of emotions: pride that he had helped his country, guilt that his curiosity and technical violation of the rules about taking the newspapers had led to all of this, fear about what might have happened if the envelope had reached its intended recipient and those classified documents had ended up in Moscow. His father seemed to sense his conflict and told him something that Timothy would remember for the rest of his life. He said that sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the small rules in order to uphold the bigger ones, and that Timothy's instinct to bring the photographs to the authorities, even though he had technically taken something that did not belong to him, had been absolutely correct. Over the next 2 weeks, events unfolded quickly. Viktor Petrov and his wife disappeared from the house on Maple and Oak overnight, leaving behind furniture and unpacked boxes and an overgrown garden that would eventually be cleaned up by the landlord. The neighborhood gossip mill churned with speculation about why they had left so suddenly, with theories ranging from family emergencies back in Russia to debts to the mob. Only the Morrisons knew the truth, and they kept it to themselves. The FBI investigation expanded based on the information from Timothy's photographs. The documents had included a distinctive watermark and classification markings that allowed investigators to trace them back to their point of origin, a typing pool at the Pentagon where several classified communications passed through each day. Cross-referencing the dates on the photographed documents with shift schedules and personnel records, the FBI narrowed their suspect pool to 3 civilian employees who had access to those particular materials during the relevant time periods. One of those employees was a 40-year-old typist named Helen Crowley, who had worked at the Pentagon for 6 years and had an excellent performance record. She also had significant financial problems resulting from her husband's gambling addiction and medical bills from her mother's cancer treatment. Under surveillance, agents observed Crowley making contact with an unknown male in a coffee shop in Georgetown, a meeting that involved the brief exchange of a newspaper. The FBI had seen enough. Helen Crowley was arrested on a Wednesday morning as she arrived for work at the Pentagon. In her purse, agents found a Minox camera, a device favored by intelligence services for photographing documents because of its small size and excellent image quality. Under questioning, Crowley broke down and admitted to photographing classified documents and providing them to a man she knew only as Viktor, who had approached her 8 months earlier and offered to pay her debts in exchange for access to information. She claimed she had no idea Viktor was a Soviet agent, that she had convinced herself she was just helping someone who worked for a foreign government that was not technically an enemy. The FBI did not believe her claimed ignorance, but it did not really matter. She had committed espionage regardless of whether she understood who her handler truly was. Helen Crowley was prosecuted under the Espionage Act, and in February 1959, she was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Viktor Petrov was safely back in Moscow by then, likely receiving a promotion for his successful recruitment and handling of an American source, or perhaps facing consequences for having lost her through his own sloppiness with the newspaper drop. The FBI never determined which, because Petrov never returned to the United States and died in Moscow in 1972 without ever speaking publicly about his time as an intelligence officer. Timothy Morrison was never publicly identified as the person who had found the photographs that broke the case. The FBI kept his name out of all official reports and court documents, referring to him only as a confidential juvenile source. This protection was partly for Timothy's safety, but also because the FBI did not want to advertise the fact that their major break in a Soviet espionage case had come from a 12-year-old Boy Scout collecting newspapers. It did not project the image of professional competence that J. Edgar Hoover preferred, but within certain circles, Timothy's role was known. His father's colleagues at the Pentagon heard about it through the inevitable gossip network that exists in any large organization. Other FBI agents who worked on the case knew, and several months after Crowley's arrest, Timothy received a letter on FBI letterhead from Director Hoover himself, thanking him for his service to his country and his demonstration of good citizenship. The letter was suitably vague about details, but it clearly meant that Hoover knew exactly who Timothy Morrison was and what he had done. The letter hung, framed, in Timothy's bedroom for the rest of his childhood. When his classmates asked about it, he said it was for helping the FBI with an investigation, which was true if incomplete. When they pressed for details, he said he was not allowed to talk about it, which made him mysterious and impressive among the 8th grade boys who thought that anything involving the FBI was inherently cool. The truth was that Timothy did not want to talk about it, not because the FBI had told him to keep quiet, but because the whole experience had been far more frightening than exciting, and remembering it made him feel small and uncertain rather than heroic. The scout troop continued meeting every Wednesday evening, and Mr. Fletcher continued leading them with the same gentle patience he had always shown. The summer camping trip to Shenandoah National Park happened as planned, and Timothy earned 3 more merit badges and learned to start a fire with flint and steel. But something had changed for him. The world seemed less safe, less predictable. He understood now that enemies could look like neighbors, that espionage was not just something that happened in Berlin or Moscow, but right here in Arlington, Virginia, hidden inside bundles of newspapers waiting to be collected by Boy Scouts. For Ernest Fletcher, the recycling drive had been just another successful troop activity, notable only for how much money they had raised toward their camping fund. He never knew that one of his scouts had found an espionage drop literally on his watch, and he certainly never suspected that Timothy Morrison had briefly wondered if he, Fletcher, might somehow be involved. If he had known, he would have been shocked and hurt, because Ernest Fletcher was exactly what he appeared to be, a postal worker who loved working with kids and believed in the values of scouting. Sometimes Timothy reflected years later, people really were just who they seemed to be. But the Cold War had taught an entire generation to doubt appearances and to see threats hiding in the most ordinary places. Timothy Morrison grew up in the shadow of his accidental involvement in the Crowley case. He attended high school and college during the turbulent 1960s, watching his country grapple with Vietnam and civil rights and the generational conflicts that tore families apart. He did not serve in Vietnam, having drawn a high lottery number, though he often wondered what his father and his dead brother Michael would have thought about his luck. His mother died in 1967, finally succumbing to the depression that had haunted her since Michael's death. His father lived until 1983, long enough to see the Cold War enter its final phase, but not long enough to see it end. Throughout his adult life, Timothy rarely talked about the photographs and what they had led to, but in quiet moments, he thought about the chain of consequences that had flowed from his curiosity and his decision to open that manila envelope. Helen Crowley had spent 15 years in prison, her life destroyed by her choices and her circumstances. Viktor Petrov had fled the country and lived out his days in Moscow. The classified information that Timothy had intercepted never reached Soviet intelligence, which meant that whatever American operations or assets those documents might have compromised remained safe. Somewhere, people Timothy would never meet had avoided danger or death because of what he had accidentally discovered on a Saturday morning collecting newspapers for his scout troop. In 1985, the same year that would later become known as the Year of the Spy because of how many Soviet agents were arrested or exposed, Timothy Morrison was 40 years old and working as a high school history teacher in Baltimore. One of his students asked him to talk about the Cold War, and Timothy found himself telling them about living through duck and cover drills and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the constant low-level fear that nuclear war might start at any moment. A student asked if he had ever encountered any real spies or espionage, and Timothy paused before answering. He said that espionage was not really like the movies or the spy novels. It was not glamorous or exciting. It was people making choices, often terrible choices, motivated by money or ideology or blackmail or simple human weakness. It was documents photographed in secret and passed through dead drops disguised as bundles of newspapers. It was translators at embassies and typists at the Pentagon and ordinary houses in suburban neighborhoods hiding extraordinary secrets. And sometimes, he said, it was 12-year-old Boy Scouts finding things they were not looking for and having to decide what to do about it. The students waited for him to continue, to tell them the story they sensed was lurking beneath his words. But Timothy Morrison simply smiled and said that the specific details were still classified, which was not exactly true, but was easier than explaining the complex mixture of pride and regret and lingering unease that came with knowing he had played a small part in the great game of Cold War espionage. What Timothy did not tell his students, what he barely admitted to himself, was that finding those photographs had changed him in ways both obvious and subtle. It had made him more aware of the fragility of security and the ease with which secrets could slip through the cracks. It had taught him that ordinary people in ordinary circumstances could have extraordinary impact. And it had shown him that the world was more dangerous and more complicated than a 12-year-old could possibly understand, though understanding came eventually, bringing with it a kind of sad wisdom about human nature and national security and the prices people paid for the choices they made. Ernest Fletcher retired from the Postal Service in 1973 and died of a heart attack in 1976, never knowing that his recycling drive had led to the arrest of a Soviet spy. The other boys of Troop 83 grew up and scattered across the country, pursuing careers and families and lives that had nothing to do with espionage or classified documents. Danny Kowalski became a dentist in Ohio. Mark Chen became an accountant. Billy Strickland died in Vietnam in 1968, one of over 58,000 American soldiers who did not come home from that war. The house on the corner of Maple and Oak was eventually sold to a young family with 3 children who knew nothing about its previous occupants or what had been hidden in bundles of newspapers on the front porch. The neighborhood changed over the years as Arlington evolved from a quiet suburb into a densely populated urban area, and the old houses were torn down or renovated beyond recognition. The First Presbyterian Church, where Troop 83 had met, closed in 1992, when its congregation dwindled and was eventually converted into condominiums, erasing another piece of the landscape where this story had unfolded. The Cold War ended, officially at least, with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The files and archives of the KGB were partially opened, and historians began piecing together the full scope of Soviet espionage operations in the United States during the decades-long conflict. In those files, researchers found references to an operation codenamed Autumn Leaves that involved a source at the Pentagon providing military logistics information. The operation had been terminated abruptly in late 1958 when the source was arrested and the handler was forced to leave the country. The files did not mention how the operation had been discovered, and Viktor Petrov's name appeared only in passing as an operative who had been reassigned from Washington to less sensitive duties in Moscow. Timothy Morrison retired from teaching in 2005 and moved to a small town in Vermont where he could garden and read and occasionally write articles about Cold War history for academic journals. He never wrote about his own experience, preferring to maintain the privacy that the FBI had granted him all those years ago, But he followed with interest the ongoing revelations about Soviet espionage, the identification of agents and sources, the gradual assembly of a historical record that showed just how extensive the spy networks had been. In 2008, a former KGB officer published his memoirs and mentioned in passing a case where a valuable American source had been lost because of careless tradecraft involving a document drop that had been discovered by accident. The officer did not provide names or specific details, but Timothy recognized the outline of the story. For the first time in 50 years, he felt a desire to tell someone, anyone, about what had happened and how a simple Saturday morning scout activity had led to such significant consequences. He called the FBI's Washington field office and asked if there was anyone still around who might remember the Crowley case from 1958. After being transferred several times, he ended up speaking with a historian in the FBI's Records Management Division who was compiling files on Cold War counterintelligence operations. Timothy identified himself and asked if his name appeared anywhere in the Crowley case files. The historian put him on hold for several minutes, then came back and confirmed that yes, a Timothy Morrison of Arlington, Virginia, was listed as a confidential juvenile source who had provided critical evidence in the case. Timothy asked if there was any reason he could not tell his story now, given that everyone involved was either dead or very old, and the Soviet Union no longer existed. The historian said she would need to check with the Office of General Counsel, but her instinct was that there would be no objection to Timothy discussing his role after all this time. The classification restrictions on the case had been lifted years ago, and the privacy protections that had kept his name confidential as a minor were no longer legally binding now that he was in his 60s. 3 weeks later, Timothy received a letter from the FBI stating that he was free to discuss his involvement in the case as he saw fit, with the understanding that certain specific details about FBI investigative techniques and the identities of other confidential sources remained protected. Armed with this permission, Timothy sat down and wrote out the whole story, from the recycling drive to the manila envelope, to the FBI agents, to the eventual arrest of Helen Crowley. He wrote about his 12-year-old confusion and fear, about lying to his mother and keeping secrets from his best friend, about the weight of knowing he had helped catch a spy but feeling no sense of triumph or adventure. He submitted his account to a historical journal that specialized in intelligence history, and it was published in the spring of 2009 under the title A Boy Scout's Accidental Discovery: The Crowley Espionage Case of 1958. The article attracted modest attention from historians and former intelligence officers, several of whom contacted Timothy to ask follow-up questions or to share their own experiences with Cold War counterespionage. One retired FBI agent who had worked on the case in a junior capacity sent Timothy a note saying that the Crowley investigation had been a career-defining moment for him and that he had always wondered about the source who had found the photographs but had never been allowed to know the identity. Timothy Morrison gave one interview about the case to a public radio station in Vermont, and listening to himself tell the story out loud, he was struck by how long ago it all seemed and how much the world had changed. The Soviet Union was gone. The Cold War was over. The fears that had shaped his childhood, duck and cover drills and fallout shelters, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation had faded into history. Young people growing up in the 21st century could barely imagine what it had been like to live under that shadow. And yet, Timothy reflected, the fundamental dynamics of espionage had not changed all that much. Nations still spied on each other. Secrets still needed protection. People still made the choice to betray their countries for money or ideology or coercion. The technology had advanced dramatically, with computers and satellites replacing much of the human intelligence work, but the basic human elements remained constant. What had changed, perhaps, was Timothy's understanding of his own role in that long-ago drama. As a 12-year-old, he had felt alternately important and terrified, proud and guilty. As an adult looking back, he could see more clearly that he had simply been in the right place at the right time, or the wrong place at the wrong time depending on perspective, and that he had made a series of choices that had led to consequences far beyond anything he could have predicted or controlled. He had chosen to pick up the bundle of newspapers, even though no one had explicitly given permission. He had chosen to open the envelope, even though it clearly was not his. He had chosen to take the photographs to the police instead of putting them back or throwing them away. Any of those choices could have gone differently, and if they had, Helen Crowley might have continued passing classified information to Viktor Petrov for months or years longer. More American military secrets would have ended up in Moscow. The balance of power in the Cold War, already precarious, might have tilted further toward the Soviets. Or maybe none of that would have happened. Maybe the FBI would have caught Crowley through other means. Or maybe the information she was providing was not actually as valuable as everyone had assumed. Maybe Timothy's role had been significant. Or maybe it had been just one small thread in a much larger tapestry of intelligence and counterintelligence operations. There was no way to know for certain, and Timothy had learned to live with that ambiguity. What he did know with absolute certainty was that the experience had taught him something important about citizenship and responsibility. It had taught him that ordinary people, even children, had obligations to their communities and their country, that sometimes required courage and sometimes required difficult choices. It had taught him that the right thing to do was not always obvious or easy, and that living with the consequences of those choices was part of growing up and becoming an adult. Timothy Morrison died in 2014 at the age of 68, following a short battle with pancreatic cancer. His obituary in the local Vermont newspaper mentioned his career as a history teacher, his passion for gardening, his service in the Boy Scouts as a youth. It did not mention the manila envelope, or the Soviet spy, or the 15-year-old girl who had spent time in federal prison because a curious 12-year-old had found photographs hidden in a bundle of newspapers. Those facts remained known to only a small circle of historians and former intelligence officers who understood their significance. But the story itself lived on, a small footnote in the larger history of Cold War espionage. A reminder that sometimes the grand conflicts between superpowers turned on the smallest and most unexpected of moments. A Boy Scout collecting newspapers for a recycling drive, a bundle coming apart on a porch, an envelope falling out and being picked up by curious hands, a decision to look inside instead of walking away, a choice to report what he had found instead of keeping it secret or throwing it away. These small moments accumulated and created the larger patterns of history. They determined who won and who lost, who was caught and who escaped, who lived and who died. And they demonstrated, again and again, that the outcome of great events often depended on the choices of ordinary people who never expected to be involved in anything more significant than earning a merit badge and helping their scout troop raise money for a camping trip. The Cold War had ended decades ago, but its lessons remained relevant. The importance of vigilance, the reality of threats both foreign and domestic, the necessity of ordinary citizens taking responsibility for protecting the freedoms and securities they enjoyed, and the truth that heroism often looked nothing like the movies, consisting instead of quiet choices made by frightened people who did what they thought was right and then spent the rest of their lives wondering if it had mattered. Timothy Morrison had been one of those people. The 12-year-old Boy Scout who found an envelope he was not looking for and made choices that changed lives and possibly changed history, even if only in small ways that most people would never know about. His story was not glamorous or dramatic in the traditional sense. There were no car chases or shootouts or daring rescues. There was just a boy, some photographs, and the decision to do what seemed right, even when he was scared and confused and unsure of the consequences. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous heroism that had won the Cold War. One small choice at a time, one ordinary person at a time, all of them adding up to something larger than themselves. Timothy Morrison might not have understood that at 12 years old, but he understood it by the time he died. And he was at peace with the role he had played in that long-ago autumn when he was just a Boy Scout trying to earn enough money for a camping trip and accidentally stumbled into history. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories, and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.